Hello and welcome. My name's Topher, and this is another slow chat. Thank you to the nearly 200 that have already tuned in and the many more that will be watching in the replay. Welcome. The eagle-eyed among you may have noticed something. Can you see? Can you see something? Let me just get rid of this and you'll be able to see more of it. Da-da-da-da-da-da. This is the first official test print. It literally arrived in my house about 25 minutes ago. For the Good People Break Bad Laws shirt. I'm going to wear it for a few days. I'm going to wash it a few times, make sure that the quality is up to scratch. And if it is, then you will be able to buy these sometime early next week. I know a lot of you are looking forward to that. I'm certainly looking forward to finally launching this. It's been on my mind for a very long time. We've got Good People Break Bad Laws. We've got, of course, the history quote. What is it? Don't make me repeat myself. History. And there's a couple of other fun ones as well. All the pictures are on my Facebook page and on my Instagram. So if you want to have a look at the merch that's coming, yes, I'm finally launching merch. Some people have been asking for it for a long time. All right. I get it. I'm doing it. Leave me alone. Now, okay, enough of the promotion, enough of the sales, enough of the crap. We have a very important night tonight. Now, last week, you'll remember, we had Crystal Mitchell, the retired or the resigned police officer, who spoke out and spoke out in no uncertain terms in a remarkable interview with Discernible and Matt Wong. And I had the pleasure of having her on last week along with Matt Lawson. Sorry, I keep getting him mixed up. Matt Lawson, who was the very first person to get shot with a rubber bullet. Now, that was a remarkable episode. Those two, both just amazing human beings who just want to create a pathway back to peace, a pathway back to the Melbourne and the Victoria that we knew. And that was a beautiful episode. Well, tonight, I bring you not one, not two, but three police officers or former police officers. And yes, I'm spreading the love around. People complain I'm too Victoria-centric. Okay, I hear you. I have one from Victoria, one from New South Wales, one from Queensland. I've collected the whole set, the entire East Coast set. And we're going to bring them on. We're going to get them to tell their stories and have just a chin wag, because I think it speaks very good things about any human being that is willing to take the steps that these guys have taken. And I want to hear their perspective on their thoughts on everything that's gone on in the last year and a half, but also what led them to that decision, and why aren't more people making that same decision, and how can we, the people, the protesters, the people who, if Danielle Andrews is to believe we're their enemy, how can we actually make it easier for them to make that courageous decision? So we've got all of that and more. Now, let me one last thing to get out of the way so that people don't ask me during the show. Yes, of course, I'm smoking a cigar. It's a slow chat, as if I'm not going to. This is a Perdomo limited edition 10th anniversary in the sun-grown, beautiful, medium-sized stick. Lovely Figurado Vitola. That's that slight change in shape there. I won't go into detail on that, but it does give you a really interesting journey with the flavor change. I'm pairing it to start with the Ardmore, which is a Highland single malt. But that's probably going to end up being a bit too light. This stick gets a little bit medium to full-bodied towards the end. And so I've got some Talisker Storm on hand that'll be able to compete with the flavors a little bit more. Okay, I think I have all of the crap out of the way. And finally, with all of you watching, it is my immense pleasure. I'm going to bring you on in state order from south to north. I'm going to bring you on my home state of Victoria. Mr. Craig Backman, thank you so much for coming on.
Oh, it's a pleasure, mate. I'm honored to be here.
Now, I don't know a lot about your story, so I'm going to be learning just as much as absolutely everybody else. I know that you did a bunch of interviews when you came out, and when it came out, it makes it sound like, I don't know, it makes it sound like a very different thing. When you resigned, I don't know, you can do that too, that's fine. But the really important question, I think the first thing that I absolutely need to find out from you in order to find out what measure of man you are is, what are you drinking tonight?
Tequila.
Okay.
Now,
is this because
you've
traveled, or
no? Being a police officer, and maybe the other gentlemen that are about to come on will attest to this. You can get trapped in a bad lifestyle, which tends to come with beer, alcohol, bad food, and lack of exercise. So, and I was no different than that. So it wasn't too long ago I was considerably heavier than what I am now. And so I switched to tequila because it got me to where I wanted to be with much less volume.
And you're now half the man you used to be.
Something along those lines.
Yeah. Fantastic. All right. Well, look, I want to get all three of you on. So I'm gonna introduce Roland now. Roland, thank you so much for coming. Oh, let me get rid of that banner. There we go. Roland, you are from New South Wales, and you've also resigned, is my understanding.
Yeah, it's correct, mate.
Now, you don't have a lovely fire in the background. You don't look quite as cozy as what Craig does. I've got to say, he does look like he's settled in for a long time.
He's putting me to shame, isn't he?
But I did give you very clear instructions to bring a drink, so I'm crossing my fingers.
Look,
what have you got?
It is a lot colder, let me point out, in Victoria.
Yes.
So the Mexicans need a fire.
Yes, okay, that's true.
You know,
that's true.
Let's just now. You did give instructions, however, I'm not at the home front, so
okay.
yeah.
All right.
Unfortunately, I couldn't get across the line on that one, mate.
Ah, dear, oh dear. Look, it's always hard when you start the show with a disappointment, but we'll try and improve from here. We'll try and make things
work
better.
it up.
Roland, thank you so much for coming on. And now let me give our resident Queenslander a hard time as well. Tomo, welcome.
Queenslander!
Now, not only are you a Queenslander, but I gather from the little bit of interaction that we've had that you're not like a southeast urban Queenslander. You're like one of these real Queenslanders, kind of a bit more inland and actually on the land yourself.
Yes, mate. Yes, we've got 40 acres, about 2.5 hours south west of Brisbane. And tonight, I'm hitting the big stuff, mate. Water. Beautiful.
Oh, good for me. Okay, Craig, it's you and me, mate. It's you and me. We've got to uphold the entire team here.
Well, being that I am, what am I? I'm a Mexican, so Mexicans drink tequila, don't they? That's the deal.
Listen, I think after what we've been through in the last year and a half, what you're seeing right now, the two Victorians on the hard liquor, the two people outside of Victoria, not. I think this is a microcosm of the whole country right now.
Hang on. I just got to interrupt. I've got to interrupt, okay? I was actually born in Victoria, okay? So
right.
I'm actually a Victorian, but I live in Queensland. But, mate, you can't top frog pee because this is tank water, mate. Doesn't get any better than that.
Good old frog pee. Does it come with its own little collection of cane toad floating around the top?
No. Too cold for cane toads, mate. We don't have cane toads here.
Okay.
We just have the good old original green frogs, mate.
Yeah, the green frogs. Okay. Oh, well, at least they're not going to poison your dog or anything like that. That's always nice.
That's it.
All right. So, gentlemen, there's a lot to talk about, and each of you have your own kind of story, I guess. So, all of you were operational. I mean, I had Crystal Mitchell on last week, but she was more corporate. She was office based essentially for the last half of her 16 or so years in Victoria Police. My understanding is that all three of you were still more sort of frontline, actual operational policing. And correct me if I'm wrong on that. But can you tell me a little bit about, from your own perspective, what was the experience of being a police officer during all the lockdowns with all this stuff going on? What's that experience like from that side?
Well, I'll go first if that's all right.
Yeah.
Look, I'm sort of highway patrol. Well, Queensland's version is called road policing. They've just gone back to highway patrol in the last couple of weeks. But I was probably on the forefront from basically when it started 18, 19, 20 months ago. I was actually recalled to duty, so I was on the border from the get-go.
Right.
And that was where I was confronted with the hands-on stuff, people coming from hotspots and all that. And after a few months, my idea of what was going on started to change very quickly.
So early on, you were pretty convinced that the narrative as it was coming out in the media was pretty spot on. This was pretty serious. These measures were necessary. Is that sort of where you started?
As it started out, absolutely, yeah. Like you got people allegedly falling over on the TV, and not that I watch TV, but the other thing is we're getting emails from our hierarchy every day, and we're given instruction on who's allowed to cross the border, who's not allowed to cross the border, who's got the right permit, who doesn't have the right permit, and so on.
Right. Yeah. So Roland, what was your role operationally, and did you sort of start at the same point?
Look, I was also highway patrol. I don't know if they call them cockroaches in Queensland, but that's a term of endearment in New South Wales. I spent the last 23 years of my career in the highway patrol. Look, I'm not quite the same as Tomo as to how I saw things playing out. I've sort of been expecting this and waiting for it. And when it hit, I wasn't quite sure of the path it would take, but it was ringing alarm bells pretty much straight away.
Yeah, interesting. So what was it like then? You're getting orders. You've got to follow those orders. To my knowledge, there is no mechanism in the New South Wales police or actually in any Australian police force, any state police force, to allow you to sort of conscientiously object and say, no, I don't agree with this. That sort of mechanism isn't there to my knowledge. So what's that like, feeling like it's wrong, but still being given those orders?
It's not that the mechanism's not there. It actually is, but it's not promoted. And that all comes back to the fact that, I assume it's the same for Craig and Tomo, but in New South Wales, the Office of Constable has original authority, which means no member of Parliament or a senior officer can actually direct you to take action against a member of the public.
Okay.
So it comes down to your discretion. It's just that is not looked upon very well. It's not encouraged.
Does that amount, though, to kind of turning a blind eye? You can't officially internally say, hey, this is wrong, but you can, while you're out on the street, you can just choose not to see things. Is that sort of what you're saying?
That's probably the wiser path if you want to stay in the job.
Yeah.
So it's a bit of a softer mechanism by which to show compassion to the public.
Yeah.
And again, use your discretion. But if you actually want to voice a strong opinion against what's happening, you'll be squashed like a bug.
Yeah. So there isn't that official mechanism that allows you to do that. Okay. So Craig, in your case, what was your position and where did you start with all of this? What were your thoughts early on?
Well, early on, I think when the first lockdown came, it was announced in Victoria. I was on leave. I was on annual leave.
Okay.
And so the way it was being promoted, like I thought it was a responsible thing to do initially, to say, let's just hit the pause button for a second, figure out what we're dealing with here. Because it could have been something that was like the Black Plague. But when it turned out to be not something like that, if it had been something that, people's eyes started bleeding and their kidneys and organs started melting and coming out from every orifice, well, then I could understand the continuing, the saga of it. But once we figured that out, I figured we should just be taking the same sorts of approach to policing this pandemic as we would with the flu, which is not at all. It's got nothing to do with us. And health recommendations are really just health recommendations. People either choose to follow them or they not, or they don't. It's back to that personal responsibility of what risks you choose to take and what risks you don't. And so I figured when I was on leave that if this thing's as deadly as what it was being promoted as, yet we were supposed to continue on with our everyday duties and go into these situations where this deadly plague was, that they'd be issuing us with bloody stormtrooper outfits or something with our own breathing apparatus or something like that, because how could they possibly send us into these places? When I got back to work, I found that, they just had a bucket in the back seat of the car, for contaminated PPE. Call it a biohazard bin.
It's more than what we had.
Well, it doesn't really fit the narrative, does it? So, I'm a big fan of actions speak louder than words. Words are just words, and people's actions will tell you what's really going on. And so when the narrative didn't match the evidence, that started pricking my ears up, thinking, what's going on here? And so, And so then when these CHO recommendations were handed out initially, nonsensical is the only word that comes to mind to describe them. And we're the ones, Tomo, Roland, myself, we're the ones that are out there with instructions, emails like the boys mentioned earlier, coming down almost every day. Do this, make sure you do that, make sure no one does this, make sure no one does that. We're the ones that are out there trying to enforce these things. And if we don't believe in these mandates or these CHO directions, it's very hard for us to explain them to people when we're telling them they're doing the wrong thing. So I'm not going to go up to a bloke or a person in the street who's not wearing a mask and try to say, well, you're doing the wrong thing here. But they light up a cigarette and then say, oh, well, that's all right then, because you can have a cigarette as long as you're, take your mask off, or, wear it into a cafe, but take it off when you sit down in a crowded cafe, or, you're not allowed to play with your kid in the park. I have to try to explain these to people, and I couldn't.
The park thing in Victoria seems to me like an extraordinary overreach. Even just if you put aside what's right and what's wrong and what's lawful and what's not and how much authority he really has, and just look at the politics, that really seemed like a bit of a clumsy, for someone who had been very politically clever up to that point in time. I felt like Daniel Andrews really, really kind of got that one wrong. Tom, I want to come back to you because the other two have both sort of mentioned either not quite being at the same place to start with, or have kind of talked us through a bit of the process of how they began to go, hang on, this isn't quite right. So, Tomo, what was it for you that shifted you from that starting point?
Oh, I think I come from a very unique family. When I was a young fella, my old boy passed away. I'm the youngest of 5. And so my mother was left to raise 4 boys and one girl by herself. Nearest relatives are 1,000 k's away. This is back before, mobile phones and internet and all that. So she always taught us to question the narrative, to question everything. And, we did that going through school, growing up to our adult life now. And so, COVID comes on the scene. I'm on the border. I'm, talking to people. I'm checking out messages from the bosses. And then I'm starting to check out alternative sites as to what's going on. And then I'm getting contacts from my brothers who are paramedics. So two brothers that are paramedics. And getting drum from them. And then my oldest brother who's a businessman, and he's giving me information. So it wasn't just a little light bulb in my own little brain. It was a combination of the family collectively saying, hang on a minute, what's going on here? And then the other thing is, as the other lads mentioned, you're on the border trying to enforce these mandates. But one thing that really started to mess with my head was the power of the exemption, where the CHO, the Chief Health Officer in Brisbane, could put a signature to a piece of paper that gave that person authority to cross the border. And that permit was somehow able to defy all viruses to enable that person to cross and do whatever it is that they wanted to do. Whereas if you didn't have a permit, then you were deemed as unclean and you weren't allowed to cross. And it was that sort of mentality, if you will, of watching and observing, and it just started to snowball. And then the more things didn't seem right, then you investigated a bit more, and then you start going down some rabbit holes, and you start to realize the rabbit holes are actually the truth. And it starts to open up a hell of a lot of can of worms, I can tell you.
Well, obviously, Tomo, your training has been deficient. We've been told very clearly down here in Melbourne that the first thing the virus does when it attacks you is check the pieces of paper in your pocket. And if it sees an exemption, it knows that it just has to leave you alone. I'm surprised you didn't get the memo. I'm amazed. So, Roland, was there a moment, because you were already kind of skeptical from the start, but that's a world away from saying, okay, I'm going to actually move against the organization that I've worked in for so long and the career path that I've had. And there's a lot from point A to point B. So what's that journey? What does that journey look like for someone on the inside? You're expected to do a job. You're surrounded by people who are also doing that job. My understanding of many police officers, and I don't mean this as a criticism, but it's my understanding of the reality, is that you end up being mostly friends with other police officers. Your social life ends up sort of gravitating around that world, as well as, even family life in some cases can all just end up sort of gravitating around that world. So it seems to me like you're sort of having to kick against a lot of, your whole world is kind of one way, and you're going, well, hang on, actually, I'm going to do this. That's a pretty big call.
Yeah, mate, it is. I was actually fairly fortunate in that for the first part of the scamdemic, I was not required to do any of the enforcement.
Yeah.
Because I was working in effectively a gangs unit. And so we had plenty of activity just dealing with the gangs and the general duty style.
I don't mean to interrupt, but can we get to you down here in Melbourne? Because we've got a massive problem with a big gang wearing uniforms and badges and carrying weapons and beating the crap out of people in the streets. If we could just get you down here, that'd be great.
I've got no idea. What are you talking about? But I was, I'm hearing you there, mate. Look, I was fortunate right up until I think it was just about May, when I got reassigned to normal highway patrol duties, just as a anti-corruption measure. And then I was thrown back into what the other boys had to do.
Yeah.
And I just refused. I just said no. I'm not playing.
Yeah, okay. So for you, it wasn't even about, you know, mandatory jabs or anything like that. It was you were already taking a stand before all of that came about.
Yeah, I left before the mandatory jabs, and very much now that's an issue, obviously, for all police and all people across the community. You know, this overreach and this medical apartheid that they're working on is just an utter disgrace. But yeah, I jumped out prior to that mandate. I just knew that I couldn't follow the direction my department was headed.
Yeah, nice. Okay, well, look, I tip my hat to you, because that's a big call, and that takes, you know, I mean, I'm not happy to see police leaving now that the mandate has come through. But I believe there's now 100 police just today got stood down, or yesterday got stood down in Victoria, because they're not providing the paperwork. Like, that doesn't bring me any joy. But I do find myself sitting here going, you know, if you'd stood on principle earlier, instead of waiting until it affected you, if you'd actually spoke up, you know, earlier when it was only affecting others, then maybe we never would have ended up in this place. But you were speaking up. So Roland, thank you. That is a credit to you. So Craig, in your case, you had some concerns. How does that lead to then handing in your resignation? And you know, my understanding is that things can be quite unpleasant for people who leave the police force and speak up. So can you tell us a little bit about that sort of process and what's happened to you in the time since?
Well, I like these gentlemen, once I saw those red flags of things that didn't make sense, I put my investigator's hat on, which is what all police are. All police are professional investigators. There's no rank within any police force that doesn't require the ability to investigate. And that's from the bottom to the very top.
Yeah.
And so when you're looking into these sorts of things, because they don't make sense, and you're trying to make sense of things, because that's what we all do. We want to try to find, you know, or separate fact from fiction. That's our job. And the evidence from around the world and on the ground doesn't match the narrative that's coming out of the government or out of the media. You start to you take real issue with that. And so I became increasingly embarrassed that my organisation, as a professional investigative body, could not see that what was being spoken by the government was rubbish. And it concerned me greatly that there seemed to be no separation between the government and the police force, which I believe there needs to be. And so, once again, I was on leave. It's probably one of the best things about policing is it has a lot of leave. Right? So I was on leave again. And it was before the Freedom Day protest that was in Melbourne on the 18th of September.
Yep.
And that was something that was advertised worldwide. That was in many cities worldwide, and certainly I think it was in just about every city in Australia. And so that was on the 18th, but the 17th I did that conscientious objection email to my management, saying that all the reasons why I joined Victoria Police was because I wanted to uphold the right, which is the motto of Victoria Police. I wanted to be a protector of the community. I wanted to be a part of that thin blue line. And I've heard all sorts of nonsense stories about what the thin blue line is, about how it's linked to white supremacy or something, and it's absolute nonsense.
Yeah.
The thin blue line is a thin layer of protection that separates the good, honest, hardworking citizens of society from those that seek to do them harm. And I wanted to be a part of that. And everything that I'd been seeing led me to believe that we were no longer that. We were the thin blue line was like a blanket, or a suppressive blanket, oppressing people from their human rights. And I didn't want to be a part of that. So I said that I would no longer be enforcing any or taking part of any enforcement action against any person who chose to protest against these CHO directions and against these vaccine mandates that were being handed out. And so that email was ignored, and I realised that it was I was going to fall on deaf ears, and I'd get nothing from it. And I was hoping, and in that email I wrote that I was hoping that other police officers that I worked with would stop whispering their objections, because they all, not all, I won't say all, but many of them object to the CHO directions and know how nonsensical it is. I mean, people used to call us because they were confused and couldn't understand what it is they could or couldn't do. And we were instructed to pass those people on or refer them on to DHS for clarification. And DHS would pass them back to us for clarification. It was a mess. It was an absolute mess. You know, so I ended up sending that email out to the world after the 18th when I saw what happened, you know, with that old lady that was horribly smashed to the ground and then sprayed for no reason. And, you know, that drew international condemnation, and rightly so. In my opinion, rightly so. There's no justification for that kind of thing. Because those, I think Melbourne would have been the only protest city in the world that happened on that day that turned to violence. Which just, sorry.
Ours was pretty extraordinary. I was there that day. I was in the kettle that we then broke out of. And of course, the media then were at pains to show the images of the protesters attacking the police and pushing through the line as though we'd walked up to a police line and then just launched ourselves at them. What had actually happened was for an hour and a half, we'd been marching around away from the police, turning corners every chance we could to avoid a confrontation. And then finally, they got us at both ends. We marched down basically a box canyon, and not the best place for us to have marched, but you know, there's no organizers for these protests because they're illegal. So it's just kind of the crowd making decisions. And we marched down there, and the cops were waiting for us at one end and were behind us at the other. And once they'd trapped us, because of what had happened previously in Melbourne with kettling and people being kept in the sun for hours on end, and there's a heartbreaking story that was shared with me earlier this week. A man was there with his wife when they got kettled on Cup Day in Melbourne. So I'm jumping back to an earlier protest now. They were held there for hours in the sun, and his wife was pregnant. And so he drew attention to that, and eventually the police let her out. She was feeling faint. She was feeling quite poor by the time they actually finally let her out. And a week later, she miscarried. You know, and that was the consequence of having been held in that for so long. And, you know, all of the protesters had that in the back of our minds. You know, the police were not kind to us when we let them take control. And so that's why there were a number, and I was near the front, but I wasn't part of that initial push that just went, no, we're not doing it again. We're not standing here in the sun waiting for the cops to come in and crack us over the head with a truncheon and drag us off to do a bunch of paperwork. We're just going to push through. And it was immediately after that we pushed through one end, and it was the senior sergeant. I'm led to believe the person in charge on the ground that day, the most senior person involved in that particular little moment of that day in that area, who then walked up and there's no other way to say it. He assaulted that woman, just threw her to the ground, pepper sprayed her along with another police officer, and then walked on like nothing had happened. Rightly, as you say, Craig, just images went around the world. People were horrified. I'm trying to find out what's going on with that. Whether people have been stood down, whether charges have been laid. I haven't been able to get a straight answer on that just yet. So Tomo, what's the journey then for someone like yourself when you go, okay, I'm done, I'm leaving? You know, Roland and Craig have both taken the option in their own ways and in their own times of resigning and moving on. You've taken a slightly different path. Is there a particular, tell us what you've done, and is there a strategic reason you've done that? Is there a particular point you're trying to make, or is there anything to be gained by doing it that way?
It's interesting. I mentioned to a group of friends that I was thinking of resigning because I don't like to play games, and I said to them, look, guys, I'm thinking of resigning. I want you to, and this might be bizarre for some of you guys, I'm a believer. I said, pray about it. I'm not going to tell you what's going on in my head. I just need you to pray and ask God, in or out, yes or no. That's it, just yes or no. Mm-hmm. And not to talk about of anybody. And then 7 or 8 responses, all emphatically, no, 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 don't. So, okay, that's point number 1. Point number 2, as I mentioned to you before the show, okay, I'm a Donald Trump supporter. Ooh, don't throw stones. I think that what he has done is amazing over in America. I think that the election has been stolen. I think that he knows exactly what he's doing, and he is probably our number 1 ally in taking on, for want of a better word, the deep state. So that all being said, I just thought, well, look, you know, I've refused to take the vaccination. I love my job. I've had an amazing experience over the last 19 years with various people, from bikies to drug dealers to whatever. And I've had really positive experiences with those people. And I don't want to walk away from that And if the good Lord says, no, you're done, well, then that door's going to slam
So
well and truly shut very, very quickly.
Yeah.
So until that happens, I'm just going to hang in there and try and wave the flag and support whoever needs supporting and just see where that journey goes, mate.
So you haven't resigned. Tell us what have you done? Because you've been stood down, or you're no longer acting as a police officer.
Yes, that's correct. So look, without going into too much detail because it's confidential.
Okay, sorry, I didn't realize.
Let's go, Brandon. I just had to look at that comment. Sorry. Let's go, Brandon.
Anyway,
love it.
Hang on. Anyway, so because it's confidential, it's so confidential, I don't even know what's happening. So that's how confidential it is.
Okay.
But yes, they've had to hand in my badge, keys, the lot, my iPad, the whole lot. So I am a former senior constable. I'm not a police officer. Okay. I'm a former senior constable. I'm still on the payroll, whether that's until they decide whether to sack me or whatever, or alternatively, I'll be taking long service leave. So sort of, I love my job. I've done it for 19 years. And I was going to resign, and then I got an emphatic, no, you're not, until such time as the door shut. So that's where it's at for me, mate.
Look, Tomo, I applaud you. I'm a believer as well. And I'm very familiar with that journey of asking people to pray and not always getting the answer that you expect. So good on you. I want to bring up this comment by Gary Markham. As an ex-ADF soldier, I would have refused an unlawful order. Gary, I was only reserves. I don't bring it up to say anything, puff my chest or anything like that. But I happened to go through a recruit course at the same time, at a time when the reserve recruit course was the same as the reg recruit course. So we did 7 weeks. It's the shortest it's ever been, but we did 7 weeks all together, all the same thing. By the very first weekend, I think it was the very first Sunday, we were being trained in by the padre there at Wagga. We were being trained that you are morally responsible for your actions as a soldier, even if you're following orders. That you can't just say, I was following orders. We studied the My Lai massacre carried out by the Americans in Vietnam to look at what happens when people kind of let go of their moral compass. And it just seems to me, and gentlemen, please take this as a question to all three of you, there doesn't seem to be an equivalent in the police. There doesn't seem to be an equivalent ethos that you actually have a moral obligation to turn around and say no to an unlawful order. Is there an equivalent?
Well, it's all there in written policy. But we in New South Wales, we've got our code of conduct and ethics and our statement of values, and we're obliged under law to comply with that statement of values under Section 7 of the Police Act of 1990. Okay. And part of that tells us to exercise authority responsibly and uphold freedom. Okay. But again, it comes back to if you're going to step out of line and show some independent thought, you want to be very careful because it's not encouraged, it's not appreciated.
Yeah. So the culture isn't there for it.
The culture from above, it's not supportive of it.
Craig, you were about to say something, were you?
Well, I was just going to say that the laws that we uphold. You would not consider them to be unjust. They're laws that are legislated through a proper process. They're voted on by members of parliament who represent the people. But these mandates are a different matter. These are something that have come about through a state of emergency and a health recommendations. And the way we would, refuse an unjust order in those respects is we use a tremendous amount of discretion, which we are allowed to use in policing. And so our opposition to or refusal to enforce an unjust order would be just by allowing things or people who weren't complying necessarily to the letter of the law to just skate through. So you see somebody without a mask and you just keep on moving because you realise that's not a problem. I assume that person has an exemption. Good on them. None of my business. I'll keep moving on. And that's the way we.
That sounds all well and good, but I've been talking to some frontline policemen who tell me that actually they find that their body cam footage, the camera that they have to have rolling, is now being examined by managers. They're going through and nitpicking and saying, oh, I saw this on the camera and you never went and talked to that person. You didn't pull them up. So it seems as though even that discretion is now kind of being taken away. At least these are frontline police officers in Vicpol who are sharing that with me. I don't know how it's going down elsewhere. If discretion is all they have left, and if that's the way it's heading, I mean, it really does seem like they're getting to the point where they are just a paramilitary arm of the government of the day. They're just doing what they're told by the politicians, because as you say, these aren't legislated laws anymore. These are thought bubbles from politicians and from their paid, hand-picked bureaucrats. How do we redraw, and this is a question for all three of you, how do we redraw the separation between police and politicians so that police are enforcing laws and not policies?
That's a really good
need
question.
some better politicians in there.
Well, we're working on that, but that's a hard road.
Yeah, and it's a little way ahead.
Oh,
but look,
goodness.
it can come down to every individual officer, and you've got to ask them, what is the line you draw in the sand personally where you say no further? Bodily autonomy, basic human rights that are enshrined under the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, the International Covenant for Civil and Political Rights, Nuremberg Code, even the Biosecurity Act, our federal legislation, has safeguards in that are just being ignored under these public health orders.
Even the
so what's the line?
oath.
Yeah, exactly. What's the line an officer draws in the sand and says, I'm not going to cross that line?
So you reckon it comes down to individual courage of the officers? There isn't really necessarily something that could be done at a higher level to really reinforce that separation between the two?
It's difficult. I think the starting point is to actually challenge our fellow police officers around the country to first up consider their use of force, consider their discretion, tactical disengagement. And as I've said previously, there's a mindset with a lot of officers that we will win the interaction at any cost. And that is just a ridiculous mindset to carry forward over a very minor offence. There has to be a correlation between the use of force you're using and what the offence is.
Yeah. Okay. Craig, you were going to jump in a second ago?
Yeah, I think what you're talking about there is, to make sure that there is a clear separation between the government and the police force. Because you don't want to ever have a situation where, the police force, and it's a community police force. We're not a military police force. We're a community police force. We do this for a job. And at the end of the day, we take off our uniform, we put on our clothes, and we go back home, and we're part of the community just like everybody else. Yeah. And the police need to remember that. And so in my personal opinion, I don't think that the chief of police should be a political appointee. I think it should be completely independent of the government. It should be somebody from within the police force. And perhaps we even go down the path of what they do in the US and vote these people in and have them accountable to the people, so that if they're not doing a job in accordance with people's expectations, they can be voted out.
Well, this is the interesting thing. You watch something like Blue Bloods, which is a TV show that my wife loves. And one of the strong sort of sub-themes, subplots of this entire series is the police commissioner butting heads with the mayor and constantly having to pull the mayor back into line and say, hey, we don't do that around here. This, we're not here for you. We're here to enforce the law equally for everybody. And I feel like there's some tough conversations that aren't being had in the higher echelon, certainly in Victoria. Those conversations aren't happening.
Well, these gentlemen will have seen, because they've looked at they've done some research themselves, obviously, and they will have seen what's going on around the world. And certainly in parts of America, where a sheriff's department will refuse to enforce any of the mandates, will refuse to enforce any of the health recommendations and mask mandates, because they are independent of the government. They're voted into a position and they can act with complete independence. And that's the sort of thing that I would love to see. I would love to see the police, based on evidence, say to the government, what you're doing is not correct. And it's not helping the citizens in any way, shape, or form, and we'll have no part of it. If the police had done that, we would have gained generations. We would have earned generations of good faith out of the citizens of this state, and would have had a much more effective police force as a result. Yeah,
100%. So, Tomo, for you, you're now sort of out on the farm, enjoying a bit of rural life, a bit of hard work out there, enjoying that. what's next for a former police officer who's speaking up? You're almost in limbo now, aren't you? Well, sorry, you're not a former police officer yet. You're in limbo. You're still a police officer. You can't really move on, but nor are you really able to work as a police officer. Where does that leave you? What are you doing to keep your brain entertained and sort of stay sane with everything going on?
Well, I was talking to my brother, who's a paramedic.
I don't know. Are you staying sane? Maybe I'm presuming. I don't know.
Queensland is that a saying?
He was saying at the start, Topher.
Yeah. What's the starting point there?
True. Sorry, Tomo. You go ahead,
mate. It's still like a holding pattern. As I said, my brother is a paramedic and he's in a similar boat to myself. And look, just to correct you, mate, I am a former senior constable. I don't want to be charged with impersonating a police officer.
Okay.
So I'm a former police officer. I am not a police officer now.
Okay.
So look, mate, I'm not sure what's going to happen. As I said, I'm in a holding pattern at the moment. We did, just in relation to what you guys were saying before about where do you draw the line, etc. Up here in Queensland, we've got this little thing. It's called the self-test. And when we're going through the academy, it was drummed into us. Whatever we do, we've got to make sure that it meets the self-test. And the self-test says this: does your decision withstand scrutiny? Does your decision ensure compliance with your oath of service, code of conduct? Is your decision lawful? And is your decision fair? So that's the self-test that we're taught. And again, it very much, some of it is, black and white, and unfortunately some of it is a grey. And I'm sure my colleagues here would agree that in our policing career, we've exercised discretion. Many months ago, when this all started to heat up and I was fairly convinced it was all dodgy, I actually wanted to pull the pin back then, but I had a colleague pull me aside and said, Tomo, he said, listen, mate, if you're not on the border, you can't make a difference. And I thought, do I leave and I'm no longer there to have an influence, or do I stay and be the influence that somebody needs? And so that was very wise wisdom from my colleague. And so I opted to hang around. Fortunately, I think this was God stepping in as well. When they decided to mandate the border crossings that you had to be vaccinated to cross into Queensland, that was something that I'm like, no, I can't do that. I can't. That's something I can't do because I don't believe in it myself. I don't believe in being vaccinated against this thing. I can't enforce that. But fortunately, at the same time, the direction came down saying, mate, anybody that's on the border has to be vaccinated. If you're not, you're off. And I thought, sorry, boys, don't want to leave you in a lurch, but hallelujah, I'm off the border. So that was a great thing to happen. But to get back to your original question, Topher, mate, look, I don't know. I'm quite happy doing the farm work at the moment. I've got 30 Solomon Islanders that I'm working with, and I'm driving tractors and forklifts and stuff like that, which I haven't really done much of before. So yeah, it's just a whole new reality out there for me.
Yeah,
it's not driving a twin turbo Kia Stinger, I can tell you.
You call that a highway car, do you, mate?
I don't know what your roads are like in Queensland, 2.5 hours out of Brizzy, but I wouldn't want to be driving one of those around some of our roads in the rural Victoria. I can tell you that much. So I've had a number of people asking a question, which is actually where I was leading with that, and you gave me a perfect segue, Tomo, with what you said there first. What happens if all the good cops do what you fine gentlemen are doing? And again, this is not having a go at you guys, but just in practical terms, you guys have set an example. You've spoken up, and I think that's what was needed. But what about the other cops that haven't spoken up yet, that are maybe where you were a few months ago or whatever your timeline is, they're where you were shortly before you resigned. If all of those men and women resign, we're left in a pretty bad situation going forward, not just with COVID, but even after COVID, then when all this sort of goes away, if it all goes away, we're then left with the ones that are just going to do as they're told, not question anything, not really think about the self-test, think about human rights and think about these sorts of things. Is there a better path at the moment for an officer in your situation now that you guys have set the example? Should they follow in your footsteps, or is there something else that they could or should do that might allow them to stay in and be there when all of this is done?
Well,
yeah, look, I think, go on, Craig.
That self-test was something that I raised also in my internal email, that our actions certainly weren't passing the self-test. And so I think by resigning, like they wanted to suspend me like they did to young Alex Cooney up there in New South Wales and put it, which comes with a gag order.
Yeah.
And I said to them, and I made a decision to resign after it was more to do with not just the violence that I saw, at the protests, especially the rubber bullet stuff, which I think was disgraceful. It was the rhetoric coming out of the government about creating this two-tiered society and locking people out of the health system of all things because of what he called risky behaviour. Now, you think about all the risky behaviours that people get up to that actually make life worth living, right? Does that mean that they all get? Go on.
Can I just say, these are bad for you. Don't smoke them. However, I smoke them because they are amazing for my mental health. All right. Nothing takes the weight off my shoulders. And trust me, there's been some weight there in the last year and a half. You should see what comes into my inbox, what people are reaching out to me, asking me for help or advice or what have you. There is a hell of a lot of weight some days, and my head gets pretty freaking cloudy. And when it all gets too much, once, twice a week, I'll take one of these and I'll go and sit on the balcony, or I'll sit in the garage if the weather's bad, and I will enjoy one of these. And an hour and a half later, I'm a new man.
Yeah.
Right. So even if these kill me physically, just know that it was worth it. And that this is a vice that I chose because for me, this was actually worth the payoff. But Craig, what they're basically saying is you're no longer allowed to make those choices under this new system.
Well, depending on the vice, you could choose heroin. They'll build you a safe place to go and do it. Right? Now you can overdose on that, and you can take up hospital resources just like any other thing that carries risk. Right? So this sort of nonsensical thing, it seemed to me to be a deliberate thing and something that I wouldn't have no part in enforcing. I was not going to work for an organisation that was going to have any part of enforcing a two-tiered society. I just would not do it.
Yeah, good for you.
So resigning gave me the opportunity to speak because, and because internally, yes, you can speak, but if you do, you're pretty much cooked.
Yeah.
Right. So I was going to come out and do these sorts of things that we're doing here now with these two gentlemen, right? Because it raises awareness, and it's something we can talk about. Now, if I can just take up 1 minute at a time.
I'm in no hurry. Take as many minutes as you need.
So part of what I've been trying to do is I've been trying to reach as many people as I can to try to bridge the divide that's been caused by these sorts of the narrative that's coming out of both the government and the media that are trying to blame all this one class of people. All the problems of everybody else is because of this one class of people. So hate them and loathe them and bully them into try to, comply, which is just, it's horrible to see. But I've also trying to reach as many police officers as I can to make them realize that it is okay to speak up and at least talk to each other about how you're feeling about these sorts of things. And maybe be a union of your own, since your own union won't represent you.
Red Union. Look up the Red Union.
The Red Union's a good alternative. They actually do represent what the members say and don't try to tell the members what to think, which is what the association is doing, kind of the opposite of what a union does. Anyway, so things like so the Royal Canadian Mounted Police Force, right? They've recently released an open letter to their commissioner, like Alex Cooney did there in New South Wales.
Yeah.
Right? Now, that's the National Police Force of Canada. And they've released a letter that pretty much outlines all the reasons why what's going on doesn't make any sense, why it reeks of another agenda because it doesn't make sense. And it finished with a call to action. And I'd like to read what that call to action is, if you don't mind.
Yeah, please do. Yeah.
And it says, Commissioner Lucky. It's an interesting name, though. That's the commissioner over there in Canada. We ask that you represent the best image of the Royal Canadian Mounted Police by remaining loyal to the Charter of the Bill of Rights and not to any particular public figure. Our job as Mounties is to preserve the peace. If we continue down this road of segregation and discrimination, we risk repeating past mistakes. The divide in our society is quickly leaning toward a level of national security. We ask that you open an investigation to ensure no criminal acts were committed in the dissemination of information from federal and provincial health authorities or public figures in positions of trust. We ask that you send investigators to collect statements from medical professionals and other reliable witnesses who allege that they have been silenced, putting lives at risk. Allow us to make this information publicly available to all so that the public can scrutinise it and achieve informed consent. As Canada's National Police Force, we are unique in our ability to conduct a large-scale cross-country investigation, which must be transparent to regain trust in the government. We also ask that you challenge the federal government's decision to send Mounties home without pay for decisions they have made on beliefs protected by Canadian laws. Neither the Royal Canadian Mounted Police Force nor the communities they serve can endure the loss of experienced police officers. We await your response and your plan of action. Now, that's the sort of thing that I would expect any police force to do, to be and demand that they remain protectors of the people, protectors of the people's rights, and not loyal to any political figure. To demand an investigation where credible evidence exists that there has been some wrongdoing and some mistruths, some silencing of people, especially doctors of all people. Right? If there's evidence of malfeasance there that is actually causing harm to people, that needs to be investigated as a crime. And if we are the investigative body, it's incumbent on us, which is why we need to be separate. And so I would encourage my former colleagues to think about those sorts of statements and where they fit, and find that line, like Roland said, find that line in the sand that they won't cross, and start to realise what their role is in society.
Yeah.
And it's not to follow blindly. It's to think critically about what is right and what is wrong. And so I just thought that was an amazing thing. Now, that's supported currently. It's not 100 police officers saying that or 200 or 1,000. It's 55,000 are behind that action.
Wow.
Now, can you imagine the catalyst for change that would bring if the Victorian police members started to think like that?
I don't think there aren't 55,000 Victorian police. I think it's 12,000 or something, isn't it?
That's the Canadian, the Mounties.
No. I understand, but I'm just thinking, like, if we could get even 5,000 Victorian police to actually throw their weight behind something like that, would be a huge game changer. Police command would be looking at that, going, "Oh, we're going to have a problem here if we don't actually start to pay attention."
Well, yeah. Well, if my assessment would be correct, if it was an average of what the percentage of people that I worked with that didn't really believe what they were enforcing was fair and right. Yeah. If that was true across every station and they're only going along with it because they're just following the orders, I think you would find it would be well over half of the police force certainly weren't behind what was going on.
Yeah. Yeah. So, oops, sorry. There we go. Tomo, Roland, do you have anything to add to that perspective? Is speaking out the best option that currently serving members have, speaking out internally, trying to organise something like that? Is there another option available to them?
I don't see resignation.
Sorry. I think Sorry, buddy.
You go, Tomo. I'll pick one. Tomo, you go.
Okay, mate. Look, I think it's a start. Look, I know a lot of my
colleagues.
I'm a country cop, and pretty much everybody where I was working could see that there was something wrong. After a period of time, like, I mean, this is nearly 2 years now, and look, Queensland is nowhere near as bad as Victoria is by any stretch of the imagination. But my point is that, look, I've spoken to many of my colleagues privately, and all in the same boat. They've all got there's something not right. This is bullshit, whatever it might be. This is morally wrong. This is like communist China. That's been the sentiment. And I think you'll find across the board, that's probably the collective feeling that a lot of these guys have. But the thing is, while they're still tuning into mainstream media, they're still getting the big dose of BS every day.
Yeah.
Okay. And that's probably 80% of the problem.
Yeah. And then the internal emails.
Yeah. So they're getting bombarded by, like come home and put on the idiot box, or they'll listen to the radio on the way home, or they'll come into work and put the idiot box on at lunchtime. And it's just this massive indoctrination, fear. Oh, there's 12,000 cases today, or there's 1,200 cases today, and there's 20 deaths and 15, and it's just ongoing. And for someone like myself, who after, I consider myself a switched on person now, but I just can't handle it. I feel like throwing a brick through the TV whenever I'm around the TV, and I can hear them starting their brainwashing every day. And it's just like, turn that off before I smash something, because it's really it's just ongoing, and it's an onslaught. And I think a lot of the people, we've got to understand something, guys, is that, as I said, we're pretty switched on people, and that's because of research, asking questions. But a lot of our community members still actually think that we're in a pandemic, and that they're going to die. They're going to die if they don't get the jab.
Yeah. I did the maths.
That's the reality.
Yeah. I did the maths on myself a little while ago based on the data out of Sweden. Sweden published some really granular data based on age, comorbidities, etc., and even allowing for the fact that I'm definitely heavier than what I could be, which is it is a risk factor when it comes to COVID. My risk, if I were to contract COVID, which I suspect I possibly actually have and recovered from already, but that's another story. If I were to contract COVID, my risk is roughly the same as driving from Melbourne to Brisbane. Right? If I did a road trip from Melbourne to Brisbane, my chance of death on that road trip is roughly the same as my individual. I'm 39 years old, no comorbidities, little bit fat. I put myself at around about a road trip from Melbourne to Brisbane. That's my risk. Now, I've done that road trip multiple times and longer. And yes, I drive carefully. Yes, it crosses your mind that things can go wrong, but I'm not canceling the trip for fear of what might happen. I'm not locking myself inside my home and selling my car for fear of what might happen if I get behind the wheel. We've been trained into this zero risk culture, which is incredibly anti-human. It's incredibly unhuman. We take risks because on the other side of most risks, there is some level of benefit. Anyone that starts a business, it's a huge risk. You're gambling the family home. You're gambling your savings. You're gambling the next few years of your life with a very high likelihood of failure. But we take that risk because there's a potential payoff there that we're willing to have a go at. There are people that take risks as a part of sport, as a part of science, as a part of exploration. People who strap themselves into NASA rockets, and now what Elon Musk's penis or whatever that was, I didn't quite follow. And launched themselves into space, or was it Bezos had that? I get them all mixed up.
It was Bezos. Bezos had the
Bezos. Okay, all right.
The phallus.
Yeah, and launched a phallus into space. I mean, that's right. Elon Musk put a car into space. Jeff Bezos put a penis into space. That's a risk. Look at what happened to Challenger. Look at what's happened throughout the space race. Like, we take risks in order to make our lives better and in order to make other people's lives better. And we've entered this culture where the government seems to think that it has the right to remove all risk from our lives and therefore remove all living from our lives. You're not allowed to live because you might get hurt. And it leads to this really authoritarian state. I want to talk Victoria. Actually, Roland, I don't think you've had the chance to answer that. Sorry. Did you have anything more you wanted to say on that?
Oh, mate, I think going back to the point of whether other police should resign. No, we need good cops to stay in the job. That's why the boys and I have taken this step, so that we can actually say the things that need to be said. We need our good cops to stay in there.
Yeah. And now that you guys are out and you are speaking, that box has been ticked. We've got your voices now. And it's probably, I tend to agree. It's probably more important now that we have those people on the inside doing what they can and, being there for when we have to, we have to find a way to live after Daniel Andrews gets tossed out on his ear. We have to find a way to be able to get back to having some kind of a, it might be a very long time before wherever the world's most livable city again. We've fallen a long way from that, but we have to find a way to get back to that.
I always kind of doubted that title, though.
Oh, come on, typical New South Wales. Goodness, come and spend some time here, mate. Come and spend some time.
No,
here.
I have. It's lovely.
Sydney's lovely if you're a millionaire. All right, if you're not a millionaire, you're going to get stabbed.
That's it.
Sydney is nice. I lived in Sydney for a little while. It's nice if you've got a view of the Harbour Bridge. Other than that, nah.
Yeah, no, I tend to agree. If you're back in Parramatta or wherever, no, forget about it. I want to talk Victoria for a second, and that's not to say that Tomo and Roland, you can't chip in with whatever you've got to say. But this legislation that we've got coming through Parliament right now with Daniel Andrews, I mean, comparisons are being made, and I'm one of the people making the comparisons to the Enabling Act. You know, people in the comments, I've been reading the comments as they've gone through, people have been saying, oh, it's the Fourth Reich, and other people saying, oh, that's a bit much, settle down. Look, I agree that that's a bit much. It's not Nazi Germany in 1944, but we're starting to look like Germany in 1935, 36. Pre-war Germany and the things that were done in order to concentrate power into that head role. We have a parliament that keeps being suspended. We have elected members that are not allowed to go in and actually participate in votes right now. We, the people, appointed them to be our representative, and the government of the day has found an excuse to exclude them. And now we have this, I can't think of any other thing to call it, but an Enabling Act that is going to concentrate an enormous amount of power into the hands of Daniel Andrews. And they say, oh, but there's an oversight committee. Yes, an oversight committee appointed by Daniel Andrews. And the legislation explicitly allows him to ignore them if he doesn't like what they say. So this is just, it's pure, it's Soviet-style obfuscation, making it all look legitimate when actually all of the power ends up resting in the hands of one man. And that, for now, is Daniel Andrews. But let's not forget, people say, oh, but Daniel Andrews is doing the right thing. Okay, let's assume that he is. Let's assume that Dan's the good guy. Once we give this power to the government, the next government gets it, and the one after that, and the premier after that, forever. Am I being paranoid to say that this is an incredibly dangerous piece of legislation, an incredibly dangerous moment in time? Craig, I'll go to you first on that.
Yeah, well, I think it's the absolute, it's the opposite of what a democracy represents. There is absolutely no need for it to begin with. It's a completely useless and unnecessary piece of legislation. It serves no purpose other than to shift power to one person. That's all it really does. Yeah. And I can't see why we would even need it.
So, in practical terms, other than raising awareness, other than doing things like this that we're doing now, what can be done? Is there anything else practical that can be done to try and stop this piece of legislation from going through, or do we just kind of have to ride this out and try and get it repealed once we've thrown Daniel Andrews out?
Well, I don't think any of us want to storm the Bastille. None of us are calling. None of us are calling for violence. None of us want that. We're trying to follow the democratic way. Every one of us, and I've been encouraging everybody that I know and been in contact with to make sure you have your voices heard, because at the moment you're not allowed to march in the street. You're not allowed to do all these sorts of things. So make sure you email all your MPs and let them know how you feel about these things. Email the TGA and ask them, to make sure that they release proven medications that work and could end this thing tomorrow. Email.
And by the way, there's more joining the list all the time. The US FDA have come out saying that aspirin has about a 50% reduction in mortality. Aspirin, right? Aspirin,
that's right. But then you see what the media did and started shit-canning aspirin.
Yeah.
Right? Started saying aspirin's no good. You shouldn't take it for stroke prevention and all this sort of stuff because it's harmful. It's the same thing they did with hydroxychloroquine, right? They did the same thing.
Yeah.
But then when the president changed and it became Joe Biden, then all of a sudden, actually, there's evidence that hydroxychloroquine works. Now, medication shouldn't. Sorry.
Right now, Pfizer is working on a new concoction based on the eye. I'm not going to say the name because it'll trigger the algorithms. Based on the eye with some zinc and another medicine. It's basically the triple therapy that Dr. Thomas Burrowdy. But they're putting it all into one pill, and that way they can repatent it and they can sell it for a fortune.
Yeah, so which is why they were calling it Pfizer-mectin.
Yeah, exactly. And so those that have been saying this whole time, this is all about money. Well, your argument is looking better and better because we are clearly seeing that actually these medications that they've been shit canning, they're now repatenting so that they can make money off them, and then all of a sudden they'll work.
Well, Merck did the same thing. I think we recently approved the Merck version of a therapeutic drug. Now, I think Merck back in, it might have been February, put out a hit piece.
Excuse me for 2 minutes, gents. I've just got to open up the garage.
No problem, Roland. Yep.
Merck put out a hit piece on that same eye drug saying it was going to kill you and all this sort of stuff. You know, it's just a big game to all these people. We're just little ants in a big game to these people.
Well, funny you bring up ants. You remember the movie A Bug's Life?
Yeah.
There's a great quote in there with, is it the cockroaches versus the ants? I think it is. And the sort of the head cockroach is there saying, you know, no, we have to crush them. If these, you know, these little ants outnumber us 1,000,000 to 1, if they began to realize that, then this would all be over in no time. And that really is the truth of the situation that we have right now. And again, exactly like you, Craig, I'm not calling for any kind of violence whatsoever. And if you watch my live streams of the protests that I've been to, I'm actively calling out and stopping the people that are trying to engage in that. But if we actually made our voices heard, if enough people stopped being timid and just got loud, surely it would not be very long before this whole thing would crumble.
I keep going back to people. One of the best ways to make your voices heard, especially like I have a business background, and so I'd had some businesses before I joined the police force. So I joined as a mature age recruit. I was 43 when I joined.
Right.
I'm 50 now. Right.
Yep.
So I had a lot of life experience before I joined. And if anyone is out there thinking of ever becoming a police officer, I recommend going down that path, because that life experience does make you a much more effective police officer. If you can relate to situations that you go to, you can I guess, de-escalate it a lot better, because you can relate to what's going on rather than just going in there bullet a gate.
Yeah.
Now I've completely lost my train of thought. What were we talking about?
We'd just come off various therapies that are now being repatented. Oh goodness!
I'm going to interject. I'll interject while you boys go the
go.
First of all, you made mention earlier on, Topher, about your vice. You like to have a cigar, right? So my vice is, it has been since I've been working on the farm. I come home, I strip off naked and go jump in the dam and have a swim in the dam. It's quite lovely.
Okay. When I said we can talk about anything, I didn't have that in mind. That wasn't really what I had in mind, mate. But okay, go on.
Hear me out. So there's a couple of challenges. I got my German Shepherds, they're jumping in, but I've got 2 geese. They're my wife's geese, and they don't like me sometimes. And I, when I strip off and go for a gander, sometimes they bail me up, and I feel very, very vulnerable with these squawking geese looking at me oddly. But anyway, I just thought I'd throw that out there to put a bit of humor there.
Look, we've all seen videos on the internet of what geese can be like when they decide they want to have a go at you. They can be pretty aggressive. I would, I would lose a fight with a goose, mate. I wouldn't be stripping off and picking a fight with a goose. That's not a life choice that I would be making every day after
I'm
living
work. Dangerously. That has not helped me regain my train of thought at all. At all. It sent me off somewhere completely I don't want to be.
Somewhere that
no leeches in the dam, mate.
Wanted to go. Roland?
No leeches in the dam.
No leeches in the dam.
Yeah. Oh, yeah, there's a good point.
Hey, look, guess what Craig was talking about, and Topher, you're talking about what can we do? I watched your clip today, and I believe there is a member of Parliament, Ryan Smith, in Victoria. Is that right? Craig, is there a guy like that down in Victoria?
Ryan Smith.
I can't say I know all of them, Tomo, but yeah, maybe. Ryan, I don't know.
Yeah.
Doesn't ring a bell.
This guy's apparently, he was talking about Commie Dan's legislation, and he was tearing out a new one in apparently Victorian Parliament today. So that was an interesting little one I've got on here.
Liberal MP. There you go. I'll have to look him up and learn more about him. There you go. You learn something new every day.
So there's some good guys out there, as you're fully aware. There's the Craig Kellys and the George Christensens, etc. There are good guys out there that can recognise that there's something amiss, and what we can do lawfully, legally, is to vote the hell out of them.
Yeah. So I'm on a bit of a crusade at the moment to get people to understand our preferential voting system. And this is, so Gloria, we'll come back to that. Thank you for the reminder, Gloria. Okay, Craig, yes.
So that's what I was talking about.
Preferential voting.
Yeah, so I was talking about having that business background and realizing that the best way for people to have their voice heard is to hit somebody else's hip pocket, right? So, and that's how unions have always gotten the sorts of wins that they've gotten over time. So, if it wasn't for people sticking together in an organisation, there would be no such thing as annual leave or sick leave or maternity leave and these sorts of things where, organisation, the people who make that organisation stick together and say, this is what's going to happen. And if you don't like it, we're standing down and we're going to stand down until you give it to us. Right. So the best way to have the voices heard in this point in time, in my opinion, is to get people who are, and the only thing that we need to agree on is not whether this jab is good, whether it's bad, whether it's harmful, whether it's not, whether it provides immunity, whether it doesn't, whether it stops transmission or whether it doesn't. All that's irrelevant. The only thing we need to agree on is that people have the right to choose, right? The right to choose. The right to choose what gets stuck into your body, and especially the right to choose what gets stuck into your children's bodies.
Yes, exactly.
These are things that we must universally agree on. And if we don't have a democracy, therefore we don't have a free country. And so everybody needs to agree on that. So, and if everybody does agree on that, then I would suggest that there be people like people who I know that work in the power industry. I live in the Latrobe Valley, which is where most of the state's power gets generated. They stick together and just say, we're shutting this show down until you pull your head in and reduce all these things, right? Reverse all these things and give these people back their jobs who've been stood down. Right.
Give us
and
back
take
our
away
lives.
all these mandates and all this sort of crap, right? Because that's what a democracy is. People have the power. And people have forgotten, because I think they've been barked at and dictated at for so long, they've forgotten that. Right. And they need reminding.
Can I add another layer to that? I think we've had it too good for too long. This country has been incredibly lucky in the good sense and also the bad sense. The Lucky Country, the book that was written, was actually almost having a go at us, that we'd kind of just skated through on good luck. We hadn't really had to work for our prosperity. Now, of course, obviously the settlers did. They cleared land, they worked their asses off. But since then, that was 150 odd years ago that the real hard yards were done. And my generation, I'm 39 years old. I was born in this country. I won the freaking lottery. What have I seen? Even global recessions and things have hardly touched Australia. War is a thing I see on TV. We've had economic prosperity the whole way through my entire life. I think we've gone incredibly soft. We think that free and prosperous is the default way of humanity. We think that this is just always going to be our lot. We don't realize that we're actually standing on the shoulders of the generations that came before us that built this place into the prosperous and free country that it is. And I'm afraid we're giving that away. We're just, through sheer laziness and ignorance, we're literally just letting that be stolen right out from under us. And a lot of people can't even see it.
Yeah. Well, there's that cycle, isn't there? There was a cycle, I think, and if I could remember it correctly, it was, strong people create good times. And good times create weak people. And weak people create hard times.
Correct.
And around it goes. And I think we're at that point where, I mentioned in a chat I had the other day that, I grew up in a time similar to most of you guys. I think we're all a similar age, and with untold amounts of freedom, and could do whatever we wanted to. And I used to ride around in the back of Dad's ute and all that sort of stuff down the highway, or sit on his lap and steer the car and all that sort of stuff,
Yeah.
And so we've grown up in this era where we just thought everything was fantastic. There's nothing to fear. We've got all this freedom. Don't worry about what's going on around the world. Everything's lovely, And so, and I said that, we've become the trusting kids in the back of the ute where, but unfortunately, Dad's about to drive the ute right off a cliff.
Yeah.
Right. Because we've become too trusting. And we're trusting because we're all very busy people. Back in those days, it was just my dad that worked and Mum stayed home because you didn't need two people working. Yeah. Right. But now all of a sudden you need two people, two parents working and a credit card just to survive. So no one's got any time to do the sorts of research really that we've been doing to try to figure out what the hell's going on here. Yeah. So they go back home, they work, they come home and they strip off or they do whatever they're going to do and they sit in front of the idiot box and the idiot box tells them what's going on today, right? Yeah. And unfortunately, the idiot box is telling them a whole lot of crap, right? And so they've become this trusting.
That's all by design,
Yeah, well, it is.
I mean, it's not just by happenstance. It's all absolutely by design.
There's a symbiotic relationship between the media and the government. They both have a vested interest in fear. People think that the news is there and exists to keep them informed. No, it doesn't. The news exists to keep them coming back. It's a marketing mechanism. They need eyeballs, they need ratings, and so they are the original clickbait. People criticize, online, the online world for being full of clickbait. Well, the nightly news is the original clickbait. When they come on and they say, tonight at 6 we're going to be talking about this, and this, they're trying to tell you the things that are going to have you go, oh, I can't miss this. I need to watch that. It's the original clickbait. They just need you coming back. So, Roland, you're alluding to believing that there's a bigger sort of something going on here. I'm always a little bit wary of this, but I'd love for you to give voice to what is it that you believe is going on, and let's have that discussion.
Well, let's ask the question as to what cost this remedy for the so-called disease is, and the cost is the destruction of our private enterprise, the destruction of the middle class. It is the destruction of the relationship between law enforcement and the community. So the pillars of our society, our health system, all of these things that make a Western country strong are all under severe attack. So this has been a very long-running process in my mind. This is not just the last couple of years. This has been in the making for a very long time, and we have been lulled into a sense of a very apathetic mindset in this country, and so we've been primed for it. We've been asleep, and it's suddenly hit us, and it's a very bitter pill to swallow if you can actually get that red pill down. A lot of people choke on it and can't. So you have things like a normalcy bias, where people just want to get back to normal, so they'll wear a mask when they don't have to. Or they'll queue up when they're not sick to go and get tested for such a deadly disease that they don't even know if they've got, just so they can find some normalcy, And so when you look at it from that aspect of either cognitive dissonance or a normalcy bias, you can understand why people fall into these traps. But this is much longer running than a 2-year pandemic.
I feel like we're being a bit unfair on the people of Stockholm to continue calling Stockholm Syndrome Stockholm Syndrome. I think we're being unkind. We need to rename it to Melbourne Syndrome. Because at least with Stockholm Syndrome, it was just the people trapped inside that hostage situation. With Melbourne Syndrome, it's the entire freaking city. And there are still an enormous number of people that are defending their captors and sort of trapped in this amazing mental trap. One of the things that I think is going to be really interesting is I think Daniel Andrews in future will be studied by political scientists because I think he's a master manipulator. I think whether it's just by nature of his personality or whether it's by study and by practice, I think he's an absolutely masterful manipulator. Nothing is by accident. The daily press conferences, all that stuff, was all designed to help prop himself up and boost his ego and boost his power, and ultimately leading to this moment where we have this bill being forced through. I agree that there are forces at work that have been looking at this for much longer than just the last 2 years. And one of the things I was talking about before all of this blew up was a thing called the Cloward-Piven strategy. And it was a married couple, Cloward and Piven, who published this, I think, originally in the 1950s, I'm going to say, but don't quote me on that. And they wanted to see America become a communist country. And their pathway to that was by overwhelming the welfare system. That was their kind of strategy that they laid out in their Cloward-Piven strategy. Just grow the welfare system, get more and more people needing more and more welfare, and eventually the system collapses under its own weight. And that collapse is their opportunity to bring about communism. Now, that's not a conspiracy theory. It's published. You can read their book, the Cloward-Piven strategy. Just Google it and you'll be able to read all about it. And they're long dead, but that strategy in many ways has just been slowly, whether by design or whether just by people's laziness, that's been slowly unfolding. Welfare dependency in Australia has been going up. Debt levels have certainly gone up since John Howard, when we were federally, we were debt free. And I was very worried about where we were headed financially, and then suddenly got blindsided by this virus that just came along. And everything that I thought was coming our way in maybe 10 or 15 years due to a financial collapse suddenly started happening right before my eyes due to this virus and this shutdown. Tom, you've been a little bit quiet for a few minutes, so I'm going to put you on the spot. What are your thoughts on is this just politicians who are incompetent responding badly to a situation, or is there something bigger at work here in your opinion?
Mate, definitely something bigger at work. You've heard of Klaus Schwab and the World Economic Forum. He wants banging on about 2030, or it was 2021, the Agenda 2020, I think it was, and then Agenda 2030 because I ran out of time. or Trump got in and wrecked their plans a little bit. So 2030 is the end game for these clowns, and everybody will have nothing and be happy. That's exciting, isn't it?
Yeah, it's wonderful sales pitch.
Yeah, so the idea is that pretty much between now and 2030, there'll be some type of virus, and that virus, then you need to go and you need to roll your sleeve up and get the next jab, and this is just going to be a continued cycle. And the idea is each time you get the jab is just one little bit more graphene to go with the whatever the hell's going on inside your body. There's a lot of angles. You've heard of the Georgia Guidestones, and we can bang on about depopulation till the cows come home. Yeah. You've heard of the new George Bush's New World Order back in 1991 and 1990. I think it was just the beginning of the Gulf War. So these sorts of ideas have been around. Well, they've been around since. Have you heard of the Tower of Babel? Do you remember the Tower of Babel?
Yes.
In the good book.
Yeah.
And Nimrod wanted to have a global government, and he actually started out building his tower and didn't want anybody to go anywhere, so he kept everybody together. And so that was really the first real history of a global government per se. Didn't go down well for the good Lord, and he came down and scattered them, and they all started speaking different languages, etc., etc. But ever since then, there's been this dynamic push to reunite us under a global confederacy, global system, or whatever you want to call it. And so, I definitely believe this is a process that's been implemented to very much bring that about. Look, if it falls over here, no doubt there'll be another mechanism over here to continue that thrust. These people are very smart. They're very, very smart. And if it doesn't work here, they're just going to come over and try and tangle it over there on the other side. So I've got my own opinions on where I think what's going to happen. I don't think they're going to get up this time around. I think they're going to hit a snare. They're going to come unstuck big time, and I think the swamp will be drained.
Look, I certainly hope you're right. I was talking to a gentleman many years ago, and he was talking about these sorts of things, and he said to me, what does a rich man say to you if you ask him how much money is enough? Right? How much money is enough? You ask a rich man that question, and they'll say just a little bit more. And I've realized that the same is true of powerful people. How much power is enough? Just a little bit more. I just need a little bit more, and then I'll be able to make everything right, and the world will be wonderful. Oh, that didn't work. I just need a little bit more power, and so on. And there's this never-ending appetite for power. I'm a big believer in incompetence being a sufficient tool to explain a lot of what we've seen. A mix of incompetence, perverse incentives, with a small number of people pursuing an agenda. I think there are people pursuing. I mean, Klaus Schwab, perfect example. He's public about it. He's out there saying, "Hey, this is what we want to do." There are people in the world that definitely have agendas, but is every single government in the world on board that agenda? Well, no, I don't think so. But I think they are subject to perverse incentives. They're subject to the worst incentive of all. I think in politics is that they are heavily incentivized to do something, right? Oh no, there's a problem. Do something. The worst thing a politician can do is not make a mistake. The worst thing a politician can do is not react and not do something. And having the courage to do what, for example, Sweden did, and turn around and say, no, I'm not going to impose all this stuff from the top down. I'm going to trust my population to weigh the risks and make adjustments for themselves. And it worked for them. They were pilloried for it, and everyone made horrible predictions about what was going to happen. And in the long run, it's kind of worked for them. Craig, where do you come down on all this sort of stuff?
Well, look, I don't think these people are idiots, right? They're obviously very clever people. They're obviously very manipulative people. I remember thinking at the beginning of this how the hell are we going to pay for all this? We've had all these different things that are issues that have needed addressing in the past, but we've never been able to do anything because we never had any money. But now all of a sudden we're going to pay people to stay home and do nothing and contribute nothing to society. We're going to shut businesses down and we're going to pay them to stay down. But suddenly all these businesses were actually closing down. Why? Because they weren't getting the money that they were promised. So what is going on here? And so that, as Roland said, the destruction of the middle class seems to be a deliberate thing, right? Like it's hard to come to any other conclusion. Yeah, it's like a death by 1,000 cuts. And so yes, not all countries are on board with all this sort of stuff. Like the Scandinavian countries are putting pauses on different, different jabs and all that sort of stuff, and saying we're not going to do this because of the risk. Some, like Sweden, as you said, we're not going to even lock down or do masks or anything. So they're clearly not all on board. But when you see slogans get used around the world, where people claim them as their own, like "Build Back Better," these sorts of things, right? Where Joe Biden claimed it as his own campaign slogan, but it's something that even Greta Thunberg talked about, the great climate scientist. Ardern in New Zealand and Trudeau in Canada and Boris Johnson, they're all talking "Build Back Better." Right. That makes you think, well, what's going on here? This is a global thing. It's not Joe Biden's bloody platform speech. It's a global thing. And what is Build Back Better? And what is the Great Reset? And all these sorts of things. And what does it mean? And so I've known for a while now that there's going to be a financial collapse, right? And when I say that financial collapse, they're looking to change the financial system, the whole financial system. Right?
Completely.
And they want to bring in the socialist thing, which socialism is an economic system. Communism is a system of government. But the two usually go hand in hand. Right? And now if people haven't been able to open their eyes and see what's been happening in Victoria, especially when the leader of Victoria or the spokesperson is supposed to be a spokesperson, not the leader. He's a public servant, right? This man, a public servant who's decided that on his whim, he's going to sell out our interest to China on the Belt and Roads Initiative. Right? How does that help the people of Victoria? It certainly does not. Right? So I don't think he's an idiot, but I think he's a very calculating sort of person. And I don't think his voice is his own. That's my opinion. I think he's speaking the words of what somebody else is telling him to speak, right? I think he is a traitor to this country and to this state. That's how I see that man. And if this legislation gets through, the only way I think it's going to get done is if he gets voted out. And that's what needs to happen to this man. He needs to get voted out.
Yeah, so that leads me to what I wanted to get to a little while ago, but maybe we should do a toilet break. I used to not have toilet breaks. I've gone till after midnight. I think it was my slow chat with Senator, was it Senator Malcolm Roberts? I think it was, went till after midnight, or it might have been one of the other ones. So I'm not saying we're going to go till after midnight, but I had a revolt on my hands because my audience was saying, I don't want to have to carry the laptop into the jolly toilet with me. So I promised that I would have breaks ever since. So it's around about 9:30. What I'm going to do is I'm going to start playing. It's too long for me to play the entire thing during this this break. However, what I'm going to do is I'm going to play you the first part of a very old video of mine now, which is called The Forbidden History of Terrible Taxes. And it's going to take me a minute to find it here. And this is something that I did, I think it was about 9 or 10 years ago now. And this was me raising the alarm, and what I was talking about before, raising the alarm about the economic situation, the growth in welfare, the growth in taxes, the fact that we were digging ourselves into a situation where something like a Cloward-Piven style economic collapse followed by the socialism, a universal basic income, blah, blah, blah. All of that was very much on the cards. Excuse me, even all those years ago. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to play a little bit of this for you guys, and then we're going to come back. Now, Roland, Tomo, Craig, I appreciate your time. If you have to go, let me know. You can head off. If you're enjoying the chat and you can hang around for another half an hour, 45 minutes, however long, then please do. And for everyone watching, please enjoy the first couple of minutes of this video. And then what I'll do is I'll post the video to my Facebook page. So if you do want to watch the rest of it, you can jump on my Facebook page and watch it there. All right, guys, we're going to take around about a 5-minute break.
Two things in life are inevitable, death and taxes. And I'm not sure which one's worse. The ancient Egyptians taxed ordinary cooking oil, and you could actually be punished if you didn't use enough of it. Sounds silly, right? Well, that's nothing compared to Russia in the 1700s, where you were taxed for having a beard. Per-person taxes have been common throughout history, but people have a habit of running and hiding. Not to be discouraged, the English invented a hearth or a chimney tax, where you were taxed not per person, but on the number of fireplaces your house had. The trouble was that tax collectors knocking on doors to count fireplaces were sometimes given a rather cold welcome. Then in the late 1600s, the English bureaucracy had a brainwave. Why not tax people's windows? After all, you can count them from outside the house. And so it was that for 150 years, Britain had a window tax, and tax collectors walked around counting windows and sending you the bill. And in order to avoid this daylight robbery, the British people began bricking up their own windows to save on tax. And already we see our first problem with tax. People don't like paying taxes and find ways to avoid it. In fact, tax evasion and tax rebellions are almost as old as taxes themselves. When kings taxed people, people hid. When they taxed fireplaces, people locked their doors. When they taxed windows, people bricked them up. And when they taxed bricks, people made bigger bricks. From unrest in ancient Rome to rebellions in England and revolutions in France, even the legend of Lady Godiva riding naked through her own town, the public reaction to taxation has varied from the sublime to the ridiculous, from meek acceptance to violent retribution. France's monarchy was overthrown in a tax revolt. If it weren't for taxes, the United States of America might still be part of the British Empire. Our own Eureka Stockade in 1854 was, you guessed it, a tax rebellion. Historically speaking, taxation has been one of the most common causes of friction between the rulers and the ruled, governments and the governed. But all that's behind us, right? I mean, we're a modern democracy, so we don't have these sorts of unjust, ridiculous taxes anymore. Our democratic system ensures that our government keeps taxes low and spends wisely. Or not. Before we go any further, it's important to ask just how much tax do we pay anyway? Just how much? That's a good question, and I'm glad you asked. The median Australian full-time wage is $54,750, of which you pay $9,340.75 in income tax, leaving you with $45,409.25 to pay your bills. And that's it, right? Tax is paid, the rest of your paycheck is yours. Except that it's not, because you also pay about $2,530.30 in GST every year. And then there's fuel excise, and of course we have to pay our council rates, and the same goes for stamp duty, and the list goes on. Already our median wage earner has paid over $17,000 per year towards the cost of government, but we're still not finished. If you want to know what the full cost of government is, then you have to include all the indirect taxes. These are taxes you don't see because they're paid by businesses, but they increase the cost of doing business, which is another way of saying that they increase the cost of everything you buy. And then, of course, there's all the red tape and regulation, the compliance costs, the millions of man-hours spent by businesses every year filling out paperwork to keep bureaucrats happy, all of which is paid for in the end by you, the consumer. And let's not forget that businesses pay council rates, stamp duty, fuel excise, and all of that money, all of that cost of government goes straight into the shelf price of everything you buy. And then last, but sadly not least, we get to the cost of harebrained government schemes which have jacked up the price of electricity, water, healthcare, and just about everything else. They're not taxes, and they look like increases in the cost of living, but really we're paying for the stupid ideas of politicians and bureaucrats. Have you noticed your electricity bill jumping by 30, 50, or even 70% in just the last few years? Well, you can thank your government for most of that. It's government that we're paying for. It's impossible to put a final figure on exactly how much the government costs the median wage earner, but once you factor in the direct taxes, indirect taxes, excises, fees, tariffs, duties, business compliance costs, failed green schemes, industry subsidies, and everything else, my best guess puts it at around $25,000 out of a median wage of just $54,750. The bit that's left is what you get to spend on the actual cost of living.
How about I unmute myself? Alrighty. Well, I hope you enjoyed that break and got done everything that you needed to get done. And I hope you enjoyed that little taste of one of my old videos now, The Forbidden History of Terrible Taxes. I will put the link to that up in my Facebook page once this slow chat is done. Sadly, whilst the numbers, of course, have changed, inflation means that now we get paid more, but also we get taxed more. Everything that I'm talking about in that video remains true. And then, in fact, given all of the crazy spending that's happened in response to COVID, a lot of things have actually gotten worse since I made that video. So I don't want to leave you on that note because that's just depressing. So what I want to start talking about with these wonderful gentlemen is what do we do about this? How do we actually come back from this absurd situation that we find ourselves in? How do we fix the mess that we're in? So Craig, Tomo, Roland, thank you. You're all still here. Let me just unmute you guys. Sorry. There we go. Oops, there we go. Alrighty, thank you for sticking around. And, it's my worst nightmare would be to come back and find that you've all just toddled off to bed and decided I was boring and you didn't want to have any more to do with me. But thank you. I take that as a compliment. I said before the break that I wanted to talk about the preferential voting system. I'll keep this fairly short because it's something that I'm going to be repeating over and over and over and over again between now and the next federal election, which some rumors say could be as early as December. But is expected more realistically to be between March and May. And then in Victoria, we have a state election coming up in November of next year. Obviously, elections are important. But on the other hand, is voting for the other big party really that good? given that we've tried them both. We keep switching between them, and yet somehow we keep moving in the same direction that we've been going in now for, I would say, 50 years, 60 years. We've been on this pretty relentless path, maybe even before, towards bigger government, more taxes, ultimately towards a much more socialist system. And now we're seeing under Daniel Andrews, and I would say to a certain degree as well, with ScoMo as well, that concentration of power that always seems to come with a socialist state. So guys, I'll do a straw poll. You guys are all, you're my age or older. Do you guys feel like you've got a pretty good grip on preferential voting? Have you learned that along the way? Were you taught in school? Is that something that has really been understood by you guys?
I don't think anything useful is taught in school, is it?
Hard to argue, Roland. Tomo?
I was just going to say I didn't learn anything at school about anything really, but yeah, I think our voting system's ridiculous. I mean, it should be one vote, one person. That's it. This idea you go in and you like there's 15 people to vote, and somebody that's numbered 15 can still get elected, even though they're the 15th last choice on someone's voting piece of paper. You know what I mean? And I think it was one of the I don't know which one it was, but one of the politicians, prime minister maybe, or premiers, I don't know. But one of them actually got in, and they didn't get the popular vote. They actually got in only because they were able to do deals with, the Greens and somebody else, and they were able to find, it's just ridiculous. It really, that's just my thoughts. Yeah. But I think it should be just one vote, one person. Simple as that.
I'm going to disagree with you, Tomo. America has that system, the one vote, one vote per person thing, and if we imagine, you got two candidates, one vote per person makes sense. As soon as you add a third candidate, this really weird thing happens. If you've got two candidates and one's going to get 60% and one's going to get 40%, right? But then you add a third candidate that a lot of people who were going to vote for the 60% guy now vote for the third candidate. Now they only get 30% each because they're similar to each other. They've got similar policies. They've got similar views. So they attract similar voters. They split their vote. And now the guy who's actually less popular is the one that gets 40%. And wins, and that's the American system right now. So there's no perfect system. The preferential system that we have allows you in that scenario. You got person A, person B, person C. Person A and B are very similar to each other, and they're splitting each other's vote. Under a preferential system, what you can do is say, I want to vote for person A, but if they don't get in, I want my vote to count towards person B, and that means that person C, who's actually, if you look at the overall thoughts of the population and what they actually want, person C is the outlier. They're the one that shouldn't get in. In a preferential voting system, you can end up with that outcome. In a first past the post or a single vote system, you can end up splitting votes, and actually the more popular view ends up not winning because it's split between a greater number of candidates potentially. From a political theory point of view, I tend to actually quite like preferential voting, but I just don't think many people kind of get it. And this next election is certainly this next Victorian election a year away. Preferential voting is it. That is our key to actually getting a good outcome. What we have at the moment is you've got your Liberals, Nationals, which I would basically call one party, and you've got Labor, Greens, which again I would basically call one party. Okay, let's just lump them in together. They're our majors. And then you've got a plethora of minor parties. And there's a bunch of minor parties that have some pretty good policies when it comes to segregation, whether you're jabbed and unjabbed, anti-lockdown kind of stance, that sort of stuff. There's a bunch of parties that have good policies on it. Liberal Democrats, One Nation, United Australia Party, IMOP, Reignite Democracy Australia, although they're working with UAP now. And there's a bunch of others. Ricardo Bossi, I think, is another one. That have very similar policies. And so we have the problem of the splitting of the vote. All the people that are saying, I'm going to vote for a minor party, I'm not going to vote for one of the major parties. Okay, which minor party? There's like a half dozen of them, right? And so the problem is a lot of people are going to go, right, I'm going to vote for the Liberal Democrats, and then I'm going to preference the Liberals because they're of the major parties, they're the less bad, right? I don't want Daniel Andrews to get in, so I'll vote Liberal Democrats and then I'll vote Liberals. Well, at that point, you've kind of wasted your vote. You might as well have voted for the Liberals. The key to the next election is people using their preferential votes to vote for all of the minor parties that they can live with. Hold your nose. Yeah, you're not going to agree with them on everything, but just hold your nose and vote Liberal Democrats, One Nation, UAP, IMOP, etc., etc. And then if you have to, at the very end, put the major party that you want to vote for, all right? But not until after you've put all of the small ones. And in that way, if everyone does that, instead of just voting for one minor party, vote for every minor party that you have any level of sympathy for in the order of how well you like them. Vote number one for the one you like best, but then vote for all the others before you include any of the majors. That is our best chance of creating a bit of an upset and having a bit of an electoral change. But sadly, for Victoria, the election's a year away, slightly over. So we need to be talking, and this is where I want to pick you guys' brains. How do we start rebuilding bridges? There's an incredible amount of community animosity between the public and the police, especially here in Victoria after what we've seen, rubber bullets being fired at unarmed protesters and these sorts of things. I mean, this is stuff that we see on the streets of Hong Kong. This is not what we're supposed to see at the Victoria Market in Melbourne. This is not what we're supposed to see at the Shrine of Remembrance in Flinders Street Station, etc. If you could put your police officer hat back on for a second, just go back to when you were actively working as a police officer. How can we start rebuilding bridges and de-escalating, not at a command level, we can't necessarily influence that directly, but how do we start building bridges at a human level with the officers that we're seeing on the street? I want to just throw that open, guys. Go for it.
The thing that we're taught in the academy is communication is everything. Communication is everything. It can be the difference between an incident turning violent or not. How well you communicate. And what we need at the moment is we need to communicate on both sides. Right? The police need to start seeing people as people, and the people need to start seeing police as people. Yeah. Right. Instead of being this side and that side, it's as bad as saying left wing and right wing. You've got to get rid of all these labels and start realizing that we're all just people. And the police need to start realizing that the suffering of these people who are trying to be heard are real stories from real people. Right? They're not buy into this narrative about the people that are just out there to throw bricks and bottles of urine and all this sort of stuff. There's always going to be idiots, right? Idiots exist, and they're always going to be. But the majority and the overwhelming number of people who are out there trying to be heard are just ordinary people with real stories and real struggles who are trying to figure out how they're going to get through tomorrow. Yeah. And as police officers, we deal with people when they're having their worst day. Generally, we don't turn up to someone's house because they're having a barbecue and we just get to go and say g'day and have a couple of frothies with them. We're there because they're going through some sort of drama in their life that they can't sort out themselves. So we're generally used to dealing with people at their worst. And it's easy to fall in that trap into thinking that everyone's no good. But the reality is we deal with the same 5% of people over and over and over and over again. And the 95% of people are just wonderful, fantastic people. And it's easy to forget that. And so they need to start to reconnect again. And so I would encourage that both the police and the people, if they see each other in the street, if you see a police officer in the street, just go up and say g'day. And just tell them this story. Tell them what's going on in your life. And try to get them to start to realise, I understand that this person's going through some pain. Maybe I need to keep that in mind if I get rostered to these kind of protests and all that sort of stuff. So I'm not so eager to go crack someone's head, But dialogue is the way through. Breaking bread is what I call it. Sit down and break bread with somebody. Try to understand them,
That's I agree, but it's also there's not a lot of opportunity for that. I mean, I don't encounter many police officers in my daily life. I tend to encounter them when I go to a protest, and that is its own kind of thing. It's not necessarily something that we can all do every day. Roland, Tomo, what other ideas? I mean, I'm not disagreeing, Craig. I'm saying yes, but add to that, guys. What else do we need to be working on now, so that once we throw out Daniel Andrews and we get all this nonsense behind us, how do we rebuild? How do we rebuild these relationships?
Well, mate, I think an old rule of thumb for me was always that you should treat any member of the public as you have your own mother treated. And so if I can say to every Australian police officer who's listening or who gets to listen to this at some stage, just remember why you actually became a police officer. It was not to become a tool of oppression. Yeah. It was not to use your powers against just mums and dads and your neighbours and basic community members who are just seeking to put bread on the table.
Mm.
And so if you can look at a member of the public who is protesting for their basic right to survive, then you need to hold a space for them.
Mm.
You need to facilitate that, because I think, as Craig or Tomo said, once that uniform comes off, you go back into that community. It's your community. Your kids go to the same school. And so I really urge my fellow police around Australia, stop and think about your use of force, because this can de-escalate dramatically just by the interactions you have, your demeanour, how you conduct yourself with peaceful members. Obviously, when there's force against police, they have to respond, and there are always agent provocateurs in these things that are looking for trouble. Would never ask a police officer to stand down from that. Those people need to be put on the ground, but that's a small number and they can be identified. But for the rest of the people, they're your community, they're your neighbours, they're the people who look after your kids, who man the petrol station, who do all the jobs that you're reliant upon if you actually want to live in a civilised society.
Yeah, good. Well said. Tomo?
Yeah, well, look, my situation's a bit different. I mentioned earlier on, I'm in a country town. And so, some of the members of the community, because I'm also a rural firefighter as well. So, when I'm not in the blues, I'm in the yellows. And some of the people, I might be dealing with on the street, I might be in the fire truck with the next day. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah, right.
So, it's already, for us in a country town, it's a totally different way of doing policing at the best of times. Yeah. And so, we've already got that relationship going on. And I know a lot of my colleagues, when they're on the borders and they're dealing with locals, there's that discretion being brought into play. There's that, that sort of common sense coming into play as well. So yeah, look, we've already got it in a smaller scale in the country town, and it's a matter of getting that across to the big smoke, where it's not as personal. Policing isn't as personal in the big smoke, as you boys would know.
Sure.
Out here, I might be in a patrol car one moment, and I might be doing grocery shopping with the wife and running to old Grubby that I arrested the other day. You know what I mean?
Yeah, yeah.
So even dealing with the Grubby, you've still got to do it in a respectful way, because you're not always going to be wearing your uniform, and you're not always going to be at work. And so I've always tried to do that from the get-go. I think, Craig, you mentioned it earlier. How do I want to be treated is how I treat others. Always, when I was dealing with people, members of the public, for whatever capacity, I'd always start out with, "G'day, mate, how you going?" And it's up to you where it goes from there. That's always been my motto. So I don't care who you are. "G'day, mate, how you doing?" And if it's a verbal spray and abuse, well, then we'll see where we go from there. If it's a good thanks, let's change your tyre, whatever needs to be done. So, for all our police officers that are still in the job around the country, as both Roland and Craig have said, please, these people are not criminals. They are trying to make ends meet. You do not need to be as forceful as you are. These guys are just trying to make do in this bad situation that they're in. And to please just treat them how you'd want to treat your son or your wife or your daughter or your mother. Treat them. They're human beings. We all bleed the same.
Yeah. We had this extraordinary video from down here in Melbourne, and Tomo, I don't know if you would have seen this, or Rolando, I don't know if you would have, but it was someone was walking along next to one of the public order response team police, which are the guys in sort of the body armor and the shields and everything else, during one of the protests, and was trying to have a chat with him. And to his credit, the officer had a chat, and what he said was really interesting to me. He said, I don't want to be doing what I'm doing, but I'm not qualified for anything else. I don't have any other skills. And if I don't have this job, I've got family, I've got kids, I'm trying to put food on the table. And that really brought up a really kind of mixed set of emotions for me. Because on the one hand, as a human being, I understand, right? He's worried about his family just the same as I'm worried about mine. But then on the other hand, like, how insane is it that we've ended up in this situation where there are people protesting on the streets for the right to feed their families, and the police that are now stomping on them are there because they need to feed their families. It's like we're here on we've been sent into pitched battle against each other, but we're both there for the same reasons. And this is why I love these conversations, because we need to realize that we're there for the same reasons. And I'm going to say, in my opinion, in Victoria, it's the police that need to realize that. I've been at most of these protests, and yes, there are idiots that do the wrong thing. 100%, that needs to be acknowledged. Those people, if you see them at a protest, grab them with a bunch of others and shove them out of the line and identify them for the cops and let the cops deal with them. We don't want them. They have no place in our movement at all. But aside from those individuals, the violence has been overwhelmingly, almost exclusively, if you put aside those handful of individuals, from the police towards the protesters. We've seen people who are simply marching down a street then meet a roadblock that then, of course, turns violent. There was no need for that roadblock to be there. We could have just done a couple more blockies around the city, and then everyone goes, okay, well, that was fun. What do we do now? I guess we go home, right? And yes, there's always that hardcore remnant that wants to stay and cause trouble and so forth, and that's a different story again. But in the main, these protests want to make a point and they want to be heard. And I really just want to call on police officers, stop creating a situation where violence becomes inevitable. If you kettle these people, violence becomes inevitable. And sure, someone in the crowd might throw something first and then you feel justified responding. But why were they kettled in the first place? Why were they trapped? Why was that necessary? Why was that a necessary response to that protest in the first place? Okay, that's the frontline officers, the people that we interact with day to day. But ultimately, we all know that really they're not the problem. The problem's actually coming from up the top. And Sarah said it well here. Police need to come out and apologize publicly. The police as an organization, I think 100% needs to come out and apologize. And to me, I think there's a couple of key things that need to be acknowledged if healing is going to happen. And I'd like to get your thoughts on this and how do we make this. Do you agree, first of all? And then if you agree, how do we make this possible? How do we make it possible for the police to say this? I think the police, and I'm speaking in the context of Victoria here, need to acknowledge that they lost their separation from politics. They lost that separation between we are enforcing the law in a neutral, unbiased manner versus the government has told us to shut this protest down, so we'll shut it down, but they told us to let that protest go, so we'll let it go. Which we've seen here in Victoria, Black Lives Matter protests being treated completely differently to others. We need an apology and we need real concrete action that separates them from politics. Number two, we need to see the officers who are responsible for assaults. We talked about the woman who was thrown to the ground earlier. There was another person in Flinders Street Station was thrown to the ground. I understand that the officer involved in that has been stood down while they investigate. So that is ongoing. There have been many other incidents where we need to see those individual officers held accountable, the ones that have lost their temper or whatever's happened inside their minds. They need to be held accountable. But I think the third thing that's got to happen, and I want all of your thoughts on all of this, the third thing that's got to happen is we've got to create a realistic mechanism for members to conscientiously object and not have it be the end of their career, to not have stepping out of line. You guys had to resign in order to be able to say what you're saying. Now, okay, I get that you can't have every officer running around saying publicly absolutely everything. It's the same in any organization. You work for IBM, you can't be running around saying that their computers are crap, right? It doesn't work that way. I get that. But internally, there needs to be a mechanism where an officer can say, this is morally wrong. This offends me morally, and I cannot in good conscience go along with this. And not have that be the end of their career, because that's a high stakes game that most people aren't willing to play. You guys, to your credit, have been willing to take that step, but most are not. So just to avoid us talking over each other, Craig, I might start with you this time. Those three things, an apology and a recognition that they became politicized, and concrete steps to create that separation. Charging of the officers that have gone too far and have used violence that was not appropriate. And then a real mechanism for conscientious objection. Is that a realistic pathway? Like, you know the culture of Victoria Police far better than I do. Are these things even possible?
Well, like I said before, I'm a big fan of actions speak louder than words. I don't see, personally, that there is any separation at the moment between the government and the police. Like you said, there has been protests during this pandemic that were also essentially illegal gatherings, where the police actually, and I've heard police say since Crystal Mitchell came out and had her interview, that police don't get to choose which laws they enforce and which ones they don't. Well, there's video evidence of that not being true, right? Because they actually participated in those protests.
Yeah, I'm sorry. This is true whether you wear a uniform or not.
Yeah, it is.
You are morally responsible for the laws you enforce and the laws you follow.
Right. So there's video evidence of police officers taking a knee at those protests, which is participation. So not only did they not enforce law there, they participated in it. And so the actions that they took against the freedom protests and those sorts of things, then that there's no other conclusion that I can come to other than it was the message they were trying to silence, not the gathering. They didn't like to see the dissent, and that shouldn't be what the police are about. The police should be about trying to facilitate people trying to have their rights realised. Now, I've seen and been very both happy to see and disappointed at the same time that there was in my local community that the citizens were reaching out to local police to try to organise peaceful protests and gatherings around this sort of stuff, which is great. The police, from what I understand, the police were very accommodating and understood what they were trying to do and helped them do that and even blocked off some roads for them.
Okay.
Right. But then after the fact, the people who were organising those things were arrested like yourself for incitement, which came down from the top. Right. So you can see the local community and police are trying to build a relationship and trust back again, but it's being destroyed from the top.
Yeah.
Right. And that is a tragedy. And that is a disconnect between community policing, the local police, and command. And they need to sort that out, because if they don't, they're going to not only tear apart the relationship between the community and the police, but the relationship between the police and command.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
And if command don't want to actually,
and
if command don't want to sit and listen, like actually objectively listen to their people and silence them through the fear, they silence their own members through fear the same way they're trying to silence the people.
Yeah.
And they need to, that's what needs to happen. And I don't think you're ever going to see an apology out of these people, right? Because I don't think they'll ever admit they were wrong any more than Daniel Andrews will admit that he's wrong.
Yeah.
Right?
So that means a changing of the guard. It means we've got to get rid of them and replace them with people who hopefully have a better moral compass.
That's why I think there needs to be a whole new system. And, you know, you're talking about liberal Labor and all these sorts of things. The whole lot of them have got to go. The whole lot of it. And we need to restart, almost start from scratch. And we need to have a system where these people who are running these organisations, including my former organisation, are voted in by their peers, by the people, by the members of the police force, who are genuine, honest, servers of the community, not just what appears to be a militaristic arm of the government, because that's just horrible in my opinion.
So Tomo and Roland, obviously New South Wales, Queensland, and especially, you know, as you were talking about, Tomo, rural Queensland, very, very different situations and different dynamics in the relationships with the public. But what do you guys see respectively as a way forward? I take it you agree that damage has been done between the relationship of police and the public and the relationship between police and government and so forth. And you're welcome to clarify where you stand on that if you feel the need. But what's a way forward from here? How do we rebuild? How do we build back better, guys? Build back better.
Look, I think, I don't think anything's going to change in the foreseeable future. Individually, I think there can be a huge difference, but collectively, the system that we've got needs to be drained, as Craig mentioned, and I think we're coming to a head.
Okay.
But I think, again, you know, as I said too, like I did see the other day on the Gold Coast, I believe there was a bit of a protest, not a protest, a rally day on the Queensland-New South Wales border, where you had the New South Welshmen on one side and the Queenslanders on the other side, and you had these Queensland coppers there. And the feel was just totally different to what Craig has experienced in Victoria, where the people were just high-fiving the coppers and hugging them, and, you know, and it was just such a a really pleasant atmosphere. And I think police officers collectively need to own their decisions and own their actions. It doesn't have to be what we are witnessing in Victoria. It doesn't have to be that way at all. Just a simple smile, g'day, man. Hey, it's not hard. And I implore any police officer out there that is feeling this uncertainty inside their gut, going, hang on a minute, there's something wrong here. I just encourage you, when you're next on duty, to take the effort to say, g'day, ma'am, g'day, sir, how are you today? Look, just here to hope you have a good day, and, just to try and break down those massive barriers that are being built exponentially, because the old playbook from the globalist is to pit the police against the people and the people against the police, and they'll sit back and watch the entertainment.
Yeah. And that's exactly what we've seen in Victoria.
Absolutely.
You're spot on.
So all you Victorian coppers out there, if anybody's watching this, mate, please go by your gut. Your gut's telling you what you're doing's wrong. You don't go smashing up grandma and poppy, mate. Seriously.
I'm pretty sure the Victoria Police account for about half of my viewership, given how thoroughly they'd gone through my stuff before they laid charges on me. We've got 950 people watching. I'm sure at least 450 of those are cops going through forensically everything that I say. Roland, any thoughts on that? Oh, sorry, Tomo?
Yes, I'm just saying to those coppers, sorry, guys, you didn't sign up for this crap. Go and get the real criminals, mate, and let us just have a good chat. Yeah,
100%. Roland?
Yeah, look, I think the boys have said it all. I don't see change coming through the top easily, but the top does not control your decisions on the ground. You have original authority, and it's up to you how you conduct yourself. And if you're going to be a mug and you're going to start abusing your powers, well, then that's on you. But this has to be a grassroots change. No society has ever gained freedom by giving freedom away. And the only change we'll see in the short term is when the good officers speak up to their colleagues, and when they see things that are too rough, maybe they step in and they create a space for these people to basically protest peacefully for their basic human rights. It's got to be a grassroots thing. Each officer has a responsibility. Step up to that responsibility.
Look, that's fantastic, and thank you. Let me just pull up a quote here that I mentioned in another live that I did just before I came on tonight, from Sophie Scholl, who was a German young woman who was murdered by the Nazis at 22 years of age. And obviously, I'm not saying that police officers right now are Nazis, but unfortunately, I'd say that Daniel Andrews is concentrating power in some really scary ways. And what she had to say, I think, is really a challenge to all of us. It's a challenge to every police officer, but it's also a challenge to every single one of us. And I want to read this particular quote from her. "The real damage is done by those millions who want to survive. The honest men who just want to be left in peace. Those who don't want their little lives disturbed by anything bigger than themselves. Those with no sides and no causes. Those who won't take measure of their own strength for fear of antagonizing their own weakness. Those who don't like to make waves or enemies. Those for whom freedom, honor, truth, and principles are only literature. Those who live small, die small. It's the reductionist approach to life. If you keep it small, you'll keep it under control. If you don't make any noise, the boogeyman won't find you. But it's all an illusion, because they die too. Those people who roll up their spirits into tiny little balls so as to be safe. Safe from what? Life is always on the edge of death. Narrow streets lead to the same place as wide avenues, and a little candle burns itself out just like a flaming torch does. I choose my own way to burn." And a separate quote, this is what she said, these were her final words before she was executed by the Nazis. "How can we expect righteousness to prevail when there is hardly anyone willing to give himself up individually to a righteous cause? Such a fine sunny day, and I have to go. But what does my death matter if through us thousands of people are awakened and stirred to action?" The final words of a woman who knew what it meant to give everything for something that she believed in. And I want to say, I think that applies to all of us, police officers and public. It applies to all of us. This is not a time to be living a small life. This is not a time to be worried about upsetting people. Oh, what will people think? This is not that moment. We are living in a moment where history is going to pivot on what we do now and how we respond and how we deal with the challenges that we are faced with. History is going to judge us. And it's not going to be kind to us if we just choose to play it safe. Guys, I feel like we've kind of covered everything that I really wanted to cover tonight. But in light of that quote and with that thought on our minds, guys, can I just get each of you just to share whatever final thoughts, whatever final encouragements you may have for my audience today? We've had 1,000 people watching pretty much the whole time, and I know that tens of thousands of people are going to watch the replay. So please, gentlemen, a free kick. Roland, I'll start with you, and then Tomo, and then Craig, and just share whatever's on your heart, whatever you've got to share that you think is important in this moment. Roland?
Thanks, buddy. Finally, tonight, just again to my police colleagues, and it won't only be in Australia, it'll be across the earth. The lie that you enforce today is the life we all live tomorrow. You have original authority, so what you do is upon you. No one can direct you to take action. You have discretion. Use that discretion wisely and look after your communities.
Thank you, Roland. Tomo?
It's colleagues, brothers and sisters in the blue. You're better than this. You guys signed up to protect and to serve, not to commit acts of thuggery. And I just hope and pray that you guys all look in the mirror unashamedly before you go to bed every night and look in the mirror and go, you did the best that you could do today. And that doesn't include assaulting innocent people. It doesn't include attacking law-abiding citizens. I just implore you all to stand up for what is right. This is the time. If you don't stand up now, there won't be a tomorrow. Now is the time for you guys to take action, to listen to your conscience and to do that which is right. Bless you all and good night.
Thank you, Tomo. Thank you. Craig?
Both, but 100% correct, boys. And that the quotes that you were talking about, Topher, very powerful. And I think the problem is that at the moment there's a disconnect between where we're really at in the world and where some people think we're at. And a lot of people think that what's going on is quite trivial and it's all about this jab or no jab, and they think that that's all it's about. And it's a far deeper thing than that. There's far more going on in the world, and I would encourage my former colleagues to try to make sure they educate themselves about what time in history we're living in at the moment and what awaits us if they don't step up now and start to do the protecting that they swore to do. Because there's a horrible fate that awaits. All right. It's not just about whether or not people have got the choice to have this jab. It's far greater than that. And so once they start to realize that, or if they can find the time to educate themselves about what's going on in the world, then maybe they'll realize that so much of the fate of us all rests in the hands of law enforcement. And if law enforcement decides it's on the side of the people, then the people are safe. If law enforcement can't make that determination that they need to be on the side of the people, then we're all in trouble. And so much of what happens to us from here rests in my former colleagues' hands. I want them to understand that. I want them to educate themselves and to understand what monumental responsibility they have for the fate of us all. And I'm not overstating that, but I think they don't understand what this is all about, and they need to. They need to.
Yeah. Well, thank you, gentlemen. Tonight's been a pleasure. I respect each of you so much for being willing to be the ones that took the stand and knowing that it would cost you your jobs and potentially some blowback as time went on, and being willing to take that risk for the sake of your conscience. I have massive respect for each of you, and I'm so grateful. My hope is that in some small way, having you on tonight is going to encourage other police officers to find their courage. Doesn't necessarily mean having to resign. We want good police officers to stay in, but for each officer to begin to find their courage and to stand for what they know to be right, despite what they may be being told by others. I know from the comments, obviously, My audience has massively appreciated you guys. I wish you all the very best as you go forward. And perhaps when all this is done, we might one day get the chance to all catch up and have a beer. And Tomo and Rolando, I will be insisting that you actually have a beer or something.
I did get some grapefruit.
All right,
juice.
good. You did. All right, Tomo.
I'll just tell you a quick story, boys.
Sure.
It was funny. One of my last shifts in the job, my colleague and I came out to have pizza for lunch on Saturday. That's a tradition we do. And we're having some homemade kombucha. The wifey made some kombucha, which is pretty good stuff. But anyway,
yeah,
a comment was made about how kombucha is alcoholic. And I said, nah, that's bullcrap. And I said, no, it is. So I ran out to the cop car and grabbed an alcometer and came in. And, I haven't drank in over 20 years, or so I thought. And anyway, so I breath tested myself and I blew 0.028. And my wife blew 0.32. And so I'm thinking, here,
listen, I have a policy.
Apparently I do.
I have a policy against drinking kombucha, but mate, if I'm ever up your way, I will drink your wife's kombucha. That is for sure. Guys, this has been a pleasure. This has been a pleasure. Thank you so much. We're going to sign off. Thank you, everyone, for watching. This will be available for replay on my YouTube channel and on my Facebook page, and I will post the link to the video that I played during the break to my Facebook page in just a couple of minutes' time. So thank you, everyone, for watching. Please look after yourselves. Look after your community. Building community is always a good idea, no matter what happens in the future. Looking after and supporting your neighbors, your family, and building community is always going to hold you in good stead, no matter what the future holds. So do that. Don't focus on the division. Focus on what you can do to bring people back together. All right, guys. Thank you very much.